Most games have an underlying fantasy they are trying to deliver. Red Dead Redemption 2 delivers on the fantasy of being a cowboy in a time when the Old West was becoming new.
Life this way? Well, we're the last, I reckon.
While The Last of Us 2 delivers on the fantasy of being a survivor in a post-apocalyptic world where the real monsters dwell inside us. While both Naughty Dog and Rockstar were working on these games, they made decisions that pushed the games more and more towards realizing their underlying fantasies. This can easily be seen in things like their stories,
What the heck?
their characters,
Come on.
and environments. What may not immediately stand out, however, is how subtly different the shooting mechanics are in both of these games and how that goes a long way towards reinforcing both fantasies. So in this video, we're going to talk about that. If you compare the shooting mechanics in Red Dead Redemption 2 versus The Last of Us 2, on the surface they seem pretty similar. You hold the button down to take out your gun, move an analog stick around to aim, and squeeze one of the triggers to shoot. But if you played both of these games, you might remember them feeling different from one another despite their commonality, and there's good reason for that. The developers of both of these games subtly nudged their shooting mechanics to reinforce the fantasy of their respective games. To better illustrate this, we're going to look at three things: the aiming mechanics themselves, how ammo is handled, and lastly, what killing your target feels like. When you think of the fantasy of being a cowboy, you think of a person that has pinpoint accuracy and lightning-fast reflexes. Red Dead Redemption 2 shooting mechanics make you feel like that sort of person, starting with how well you aim. The game has some pretty aggressive target locking enabled. Not only is the feature turned on by default, it is cranked all the way up, and I think they've done so deliberately to make you feel like a highly skilled cowboy. When you aim at your target in Red Dead, your character locks onto your opponent's center of mass provided they're within your field of view. Now when you think of the fantasy of being a protagonist in an old western, you don't doubt that they can hit their target. So naturally, when you aim in Red Dead, you snap onto your target because Arthur Morgan is competent enough to know where to point his gun. Something that immediately jumps to mind when talking about systems like target locking is that they take away from the skill of shooting and could end up feeling more like a cheat than anything else. In fact, this target locking didn't feel like it detracted too much from the skill of the game, since enemies never die from a single shot to the chest or stomach. You often need to shoot your target 3 to 5 times before they drop dead. But if you get particularly good at aiming, you learn to flick your analog stick up slightly as soon as you aim at your target to quickly aim at your opponent's head, which allows you to kill them with a single shot. At times while doing this, you might overshoot by just a little bit and end up shooting the hat off of your target instead. Which is yet another small thing in Red Dead that reinforces the fantasy of being a cowboy, since that is somewhat of a trope in westerns. And when you combine all that, you end up with some smooth feeling shooting mechanics that are both familiar yet thematically appropriate to the game you are playing. Now there are many other mechanics in Red Dead that fortify the fantasy of being a cowboy, but those are pretty obvious, so we won't go over them here. Instead, we're now going to take a look at how The Last of Us 2 handles their aiming. A running theme you will notice as we compare these two games is how Red Dead Redemption 2 works hard to make you feel competent, while The Last of Us 2 isn't really designed to make you feel particularly good about anything. It focuses more and more on making you feel inept and uncomfortable while you constantly second guess and even regret your actions. And a lot of those design decisions, environment choices, and narrative moments are meant to reinforce that general feeling. They've even gone so far as to have that feeling come across in their shooting mechanics. Just like Red Dead, The Last of Us 2 has target snapping enabled, but it is nowhere near as aggressive. Comparatively, when you aim at your target in The Last of Us, you actually have to do the aiming yourself. And depending on your competence with the controller, aiming might feel a little clunky, especially if you play these two games side by side. But the fantasy of The Last of Us 2 isn't one of competence, skill, and glory. It's one of desperation, hardship, and survival. I'd wager that the game would have a very hard time getting you to feel invested in the world if you were running around like Arthur Morgan dealing with dozens of enemies easily. By contrast, the characters you play in The Last of Us are normal people that had to learn new skills to get by. As talented as Ellie might be at shooting a gun, she's not meant to represent the mythical skill of a cowboy. She's still meant to be a normal person. Because of that, aiming in The Last of Us 2 feels worse. It's clunkier, uncomfortable, and sometimes even painful. The game doesn't do you any favors here. Every shot you fire, every kill you perform, it is all done out of necessity and has a lot more weight to it. Another thing worth noting about The Last of Us 2 is how aggressive the enemy AI is. In games like these, it's not uncommon to script AI to miss fairly frequently to give the player the chance to react, but in The Last of Us 2, the AI is generally a crack shot. This again reinforces that feeling of helplessness and makes you approach a gunfight differently. Where in Red Dead you don't mind taking on 5 to 6 people at once, in The Last of Us you generally seek cover immediately and try to go for flanks wherever possible. And the last thing worth mentioning in The Last of Us 2 is how your character reacts to getting shot. Where in Red Dead your character generally shrugs it off, in The Last of Us, Ellie's whole body reacts to it. And it's even possible to get knocked on your back and have your mobility taken away from you. All that comes together to reinforce more and more the general theme of ineptitude and desperation that The Last of Us 2 wants to convey. Two other aspects that differ between the two games are the abundance of ammo and how enemies die. In Red Dead Redemption 2, you generally have an abundance of ammo and for good reason. The more you're shooting, the more you feel like a cowboy. When you're in a gunfight in Red Dead, you hear the crackles and explosions of different guns shooting all around you, which again helps immerse you in the fantasy of the Old West. In The Last of Us 2, however, bullets are rare and hard to come by. So much so that you might find yourself in a gunfight with only 2 or 3 bullets and you have to make them count. This does feel bad by Red Dead standards, but ultimately reinforces that feeling of helpless desperation Naughty Dog is keen on conveying. And the final thing worth talking about is what happens to enemies when you kill them. In Red Dead, you get the traditional treatments that are all designed to make you feel powerful. Your opponents ragdoll off their horses, and you have a few juicy execution moves that feel good. You feel nothing but satisfaction as you kill a comical amount of bad guys. Naughty Dog, on the other hand, went through a lot of effort implementing a set of features designed to make you feel bad about what you're doing. In an attempt to humanize your foes, the AI call each other out using their names and react emotionally when they find out their friends have been killed.
I don't see anything. Oh shit! Kevin!
And where Red Dead gave you satisfying finishing moves that make you feel powerful, The Last of Us does the opposite. Sometimes when you kill an enemy, they squirm and broadcast awful sounds meant to convey a slow and agonizing death. Building games around a core and compelling fantasy often results in some truly memorable experiences. I hope today's examples illustrated how even the subtlest of shifts in seemingly identical systems can go a long way towards reinforcing those underlying fantasies. Thanks again for watching, and see you all next time.